Can a school bus vanish without a trace? 10 boys, one ordinary morning, then 10 years of silence. No bodies, no crash, no witnesses, just a chilling absence and unanswered questions. Where did they go? And who or what was waiting for them? A story built on mystery, investigation, and unsettling truths. But beware. What you're about to discover can never be forgotten. The morning of Monday, October 14th, 1991, began like any other in the quiet town of Eldrewood. The air was crisp, the sky painted in soft gray, and the scent of pine clung to the early fog that rolled through the empty streets. Parents sipped coffee, kissed their children goodbye, and watched as their sons, 10 boys aged between 9 and 13, climbed into bus number 37 bound for Eldrewood Middle School. At exactly 7:32 a.m., the bus pulled away from Maple Street, turning onto the narrow forest road that cut through the woods, a shortcut used for decades. Behind the wheel was Mr. Clarence Doyle, a well-liked veteran driver, always punctual, always calm. He waved at a passing jogger and turned the corner, vanishing from the town's memory. By 8:05 a.m., the school receptionist made her first call. Bus 37 hasn't arrived yet. By 8:30, the first parent showed up at the school asking about her son. By 9:15, 4 police cars were combing the route between Maple Street and the school. There were no tire marks, no signs of an accident, no witnesses who saw the bus beyond the curve in the road. It had simply disappeared. The police knocked on every door near the forest edge. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters flew over the thick woods. News vans started arriving by afternoon. The entire town stood still, holding its breath. By evening, parents who once stood silently outside the school gates were screaming in desperation, refusing to go home. That night, Mayor Thomas Greaves held a press conference. "We are treating this as a critical emergency. Every state resource is being used to locate the missing bus and children. Please remain calm." But no one was calm. The town's streets remained lit through the night, porch lights glowing like little beacons in the dark. Mothers sat by the phone. Fathers paced. Neighbors whispered. As the clock struck midnight, a mother, Sarah Whitmore, mother of 11-year-old Jessie, stood alone by the woods, staring into the black trees and whispering her son's name. In Eldrewood, that day would never be just another Monday. It became known as the morning that never came. In the weeks following the disappearance, Eldrewood became a town suspended in time. The pumpkins outside homes rotted untouched. The laughter of children vanished from the parks. No one talked about Halloween. October bled into November and then December. But the 10 empty desks at Eldrewood Middle School remained untouched, as if their owners might return at any moment. The police investigation stalled. Hundreds of volunteers had combed the forest day after day. Divers searched nearby lakes. Roads were dug up, nearby junkyards were inspected, and even rumors of cult activity were quietly explored. But there was nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no signals, and no sound. What the investigation lacked in answers, the parents made up for in resolve. At the heart of the resistance were 3 mothers: Sarah Whitmore, mother of Jessie, the boy with the sketchbook; Nina Alvarez, mother of twins, Lucas and Leo; Margaret Hill, a retired nurse and mother of Daniel, the youngest of the 10. They formed what the town began calling the Circle of 10, a name that would later echo in newspapers and documentaries. Every morning at 7:32 a.m., the exact time the bus had vanished, they met at the wood's edge. Every evening they posted new flyers, even when the old ones fluttered, faded, and torn under the rain. Sarah kept a log of every detail: license plates of suspicious cars, names of passing strangers, news clippings, interviews. Nina, fluent in both Spanish and English, called regional media stations, begging them not to forget the story. Margaret, with her clinical mind, built a wall in her basement, filled with photos, maps, and a calendar with the words Day 1, Day 2, Day 100, written in red. Their grief didn't make them weak. It turned them into warriors. But grief isn't equal. While some parents clung to hope, others began to crumble. One father turned to alcohol. Another family moved out of Eldrewood entirely. Some marriages cracked under the weight of unanswered prayers. Behind closed doors, the police started shifting resources. Officially, the case was still active. Unofficially, whispers grew. Maybe they ran away. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe we'll never know. But the Circle of 10 refused to stop. They raised money, hired private investigators, and even offered a $50,000 reward. Still, silence. Nothing. No one. Not a single trace. Until nearly 10 years later, something stirred the ashes. Something so small it could have been missed. But it wasn't. And it changed everything. It was a damp morning in early spring, 1992, nearly 6 months after the disappearance, when an old man named Eugene Tarlow walked into the Eldrewood Police Department, holding a crumpled paper bag. A known recluse, Eugene lived in a cabin deep in the southern forest, far from town. Most people thought he was half blind, half crazy, and fully harmless. But that morning, he spoke clearly. "I saw the bus," he said, placing the bag on the desk. "I saw it take the wrong road." Inside the bag was a faded sketch, drawn shakily with charcoal, showing a forest path and a yellow shape disappearing behind the trees. Detective Miller, who was overseeing the case, humored the old man at first. He'd heard plenty of false leads from fortune-tellers, conspiracy theorists, and even a woman who claimed aliens took the bus. But Eugene wasn't selling a story. He wasn't even asking for money. He simply said, "There's a road no one remembers. It used to lead to the old government facility, the one near Dead Oak Hill. They closed it in the 60s, but the road's still there, just covered in time." Miller raised an eyebrow. That land had been sealed for decades, supposedly due to a chemical spill in 1967. No public access, no maps showed the road anymore. Still, something about Eugene's eyes disturbed the detective. The next morning, an officer was sent to check. He returned empty-handed. "There's no road, just trees." The tip was dismissed. Eugene's drawing was filed away in a folder labeled "Unverified Testimony, No Action." But one man remembered. Richard Mills, a young officer then, had listened to Eugene's story and quietly copied the sketch before it was shelved. He marked it in his notebook and kept it for years, even after transferring out of Eldrewood in 1995. Something about Eugene's voice had clung to him, like smoke in his lungs. As the years passed, most people forgot the man in the woods. He died in 1998, alone and uncelebrated. But his words would return. Because in October 2001, almost exactly 10 years after the disappearance, a teenage boy exploring those very woods found something strange sticking out of the soil, a metallic shard, painted in flaked yellow, with the faint imprint of a number. Mupater, October 14th, 2001. The sky above Eldrewood looked nearly identical to that morning 10 years ago. Muted clouds, pale sunlight, the kind of eerie stillness that made people glance over their shoulders. But this day would not go quietly. Just outside the southern edge of the woods, 15-year-old Tommy Griggs, a curious teenager with a rusted metal detector and a love for local legends, wandered through the forgotten trails with his friend. The boys had heard stories of missing children, of ghosts in the trees, of a bus that drove into the forest and never came back. But to them, it was just something to joke about. A dare. Until the detector gave a sharp beep. They dug through damp soil and twisted roots. About a foot down, Tommy's hand hit something cold and solid. He pulled it free, brushed off the dirt, and stared. It was a metal fragment, roughly the size of a license plate. The paint was mostly gone, but one thing was still visible. A white number stamped against old, faded yellow. 37. By the next day, the fragment was in the hands of the Elderwood Police Department. When they verified the paint and the metal composition, the truth became unavoidable. It was part of the missing school bus. News spread fast. The story that had been buried by time exploded across local and national headlines. Breakthrough in decade-old mystery. Bus 37. Evidence found after 10 years. In the midst of the chaos, one name returned to the case files with a red underline: Detective Richard Mills. Now, in his mid-40s and living in another state, Mills received a call late at night from Elderwood's new police chief. "You once said you had a copy of an old man's sketch?" "I still do," Mills replied, heart pounding. The department invited Mills back as a consultant. He wasn't just returning to a case. He was returning to a promise he had made a decade ago, that if anything ever surfaced, he would finish what was started. The town braced itself. Parents, now a decade older, some divorced, some broken, gathered once more in the community center where they had met so many times before. Sarah Whitmore, older now with silver streaks in her hair and dark circles under her eyes, stood silently in the back, clutching her son's drawing notebook, the only thing she had left of Jesse. This wasn't just another investigation. This was the last chance. Detective Richard Mills stepped back into Elderwood for the first time in 6 years. The town hadn't changed much. Same crooked mailboxes, same aging storefronts, and the same uneasy silence that seemed to hum beneath the streets. But the people, they had changed. Time had worn them down, not just with age, but with grief that had never found a place to land. His first stop wasn't the police station. It was Margaret Hill's house. The walls of her basement, once filled with maps and notes and photos, were still intact, a private archive of obsession. Newspaper clippings curled from moisture, strings connected locations, timelines, and names. In the center, a photo of Bus 37, surrounded by 10 school portraits, stared back like an accusation. "You kept it all," Mills said quietly. "I told myself if I ever took it down, he'd be gone for good," Margaret replied. Mills took out his old notebook and laid Eugene Tarlow's copied sketch on the table. Margaret froze. "Where did you get that?" "It was never filed. I copied it before they buried the tip." "Dead Oak Hill," she whispered. "We always felt something wasn't right there." Back at the station, Mills began cross-referencing old reports. Something stood out, a line buried in an incident log from the day of the disappearance. Unidentified white cargo truck seen entering Forest Road near mile marker 9, reported by anonymous caller. No follow-up made. He circled it in red. Later that evening, he met with Nina Alvarez, who now worked part-time at the town library. She had been keeping her own file. Among her notes was a photocopy of a missing vehicle report from October 1991. A decommissioned military truck from a nearby base, marked as stolen the same morning the bus vanished. None of this had ever made the official case summary. "You're telling me a military truck went missing the same morning a school bus disappeared, and no one thought to connect them?" Mills asked. "Or someone didn't want them connected," Nina answered. The implications were growing darker. They were no longer just searching for a bus. They were chasing a cover-up, one possibly involving government property, restricted land, and a forgotten facility the public had been told no longer existed. That night, Sarah Whitmore received an unmarked envelope on her doorstep. No name. No return address. Inside was a single photo. A blurry, grainy image, clearly old, of 10 boys sitting on a bus. The photo had been ripped, but across the bottom, someone had written in shaky ink, "They were never supposed to be there." Sarah collapsed to the floor, clutching the photo like it was breathing. The wound had never healed. It had just waited for someone to tear it open again. The discovery came by accident. A week after Mills reopened the investigation, a new search team was assembled, trained in forensic archaeology and environmental scanning. The area surrounding Dead Oak Hill, previously written off, was now the focus. With updated satellite maps and ground-penetrating radar, they began scanning for anomalies beneath the forest floor. And they found one. Roughly half a mile from the hilltop, buried under thick moss and twisted roots, they detected an unnatural rectangular shape, about 5 feet wide, sealed in metal, and cold to the touch. The team dug carefully. The ground gave way to reveal a heavy metallic box, bolted shut with no visible hinges or markings. No lock, just rust. Inside, the air was stale and sour, the smell of time compressed. The officers and scientists opened it slowly, expecting a time capsule, maybe a maintenance crate. What they found was neither. Inside were 4 shredded pieces of navy blue fabric, the remnants of what looked like school uniforms. A plastic lunchbox rusted shut, a stack of photographs, all undeveloped film negatives sealed in a weathered envelope. And at the bottom, tucked beneath the layers, a small leather-bound notebook with initials etched faintly. L.H. The name, Liam Harper, one of the missing boys. The notebook's pages were warped, but the ink had survived. Each page was dated with only numbers, day 1, day 2, day 3. They said we weren't supposed to be there. One of the men had a mask. He had a patch with a triangle. We sleep on the floor, no windows, no light, only the humming. I think Jesse saw something in the vent. Lucas is gone. They say he's with the others. Page after page painted a surreal and horrifying picture, not of a crash, but of captivity. No exact dates, no locations, just fragments. References to men in white suits, tests, and repeated phrases like, "We were not the first." The negatives were rushed to a nearby lab for recovery. After 4 days of delicate processing, 5 images were salvaged. One showed a boy's face, pale, frightened, with markings on his cheek. Another showed a hallway of metal walls, with overhead lights and no windows. But the last image, it showed the interior of a bus, dimly lit, empty, but with a shadowed figure barely visible in the far corner. Blurred, watching. The media never saw the photos. Authorities issued a statement claiming the contents were inconclusive. But within the investigation team, silence fell like a curtain. Mills, however, refused to be silenced. "We're not chasing a ghost story," he told the team. "We've stumbled into something built to be forgotten." And yet something still remained missing. The bus itself. And perhaps more terrifying. Where were the boys now? The search team expanded the perimeter. Using the old sketch from Eugene Tarlow and the coordinates marked in Liam Harper's notebook, they triangulated a zone west of Dead Oak Hill, a dried-out lakebed hidden beneath layers of undergrowth and mud. Decades ago, it had been called Mirror Lake, a man-made reservoir drained and abandoned after the so-called chemical spill in 1967. Official records said the area was unstable, unsafe, unremarkable. But satellite imaging showed something beneath the earth. A long, curved shape, half buried under years of mud. Mills stood at the edge when the excavation began. He didn't speak. He barely breathed. By the end of the second day, the crew uncovered a rusted vehicle frame. Curved metal ribs, a shattered windshield, a torn rubber strip hanging like dead skin. It was Bus 37, not tipped over, not crashed. It had been sunk intentionally, its wheels removed, its windows painted over from the inside. The bus was empty. No seats remained. The floor was covered in a thick layer of sludge. There were no bodies, no bones. But the strangest discovery lay in the rear wall of the bus, where someone had scratched words using what looked like a key or a nail. "They watched us from behind the mirror." The phrase echoed something Liam Harper had written. Forensics found fingerprints, faint, degraded, but belonging to at least 7 different children, matching 3 of the missing boys from 1991. How their prints remained after so long was a mystery. The temperature, the moisture, none of it made sense. It was as if the bus had been preserved, hidden from time. And yet, the evidence confirmed something chilling. The boys had been alive after the disappearance, possibly for weeks, maybe longer. On the final day of the recovery, divers found a sealed container tucked beneath the frame, wedged between rusted metal and packed mud. Inside, wrapped in plastic and cloth, was a school backpack. It belonged to Jesse Whitmore. Inside the bag was a pencil case, a crumpled comic book, and a torn corner of a photograph. It showed all 10 boys sitting on the bus, smiling. But someone had drawn X's over 7 of the faces. Only 3 were left unmarked. And beside the photo, a message written in childlike scrawl. Only the quiet ones made it out. That night, Sarah Whitmore stood alone by the edge of the dried lake, clutching the backpack to her chest. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply asked, "Where did they go next?" The town of Eldrewood no longer wanted answers, but Mills was close. He could feel it. The mirror had cracked. Something was coming through. October 31st, 2001. 10 years to the day since the town held the first vigil. 10 years since Bus 37 vanished. And now, with fragments of truth unearthed, the air around Eldrewood felt heavier than ever. Detective Mills gathered what he had: Eugene's sketch, Liam's notebook, the photos, the metal box, the prints, the bus, the message etched into steel, and sent them to a retired intelligence contact he once trusted. The man returned a single sentence in response. "You're standing on government soil they wanted forgotten." The road Eugene had drawn was real. Once part of a classified military testing zone in the 60s, the site had been officially closed after a failed psychological experiment, one rumored to involve sensory deprivation, mirror interrogation, and isolation chambers for children, used under a now-defunct Black Ops program. The land had been sealed, the records shredded. But someone, some organization, had kept operating in secret. The military truck reported stolen in 1991 was traced back to a decommissioned unit connected to that very facility. It was used once, the same morning the bus disappeared, then vanished completely. Mills now believed the bus had never crashed. It had been redirected, intercepted. 10 innocent boys, rerouted into a nightmare that had been buried decades before. But why? That question never got a clear answer. Only pieces. 2 weeks after the discovery of the bus, a small box was delivered to Sarah Whitmore's door. No stamp, no name. Inside was a cassette tape. Shaking, she placed it in an old player. Static filled the room, then a voice, young, trembling. "Mom, I don't know what day it is, but I miss you. I miss the sky. There are no windows here, just lights and mirrors that talk back." Then silence. Then screaming. The tape ended. Authorities dismissed it as a hoax. Mills disagreed. But then came the final blow. A security officer at a storage facility, 2 towns over, was arrested for breaking and entering. When the facility was searched, they found 3 sealed containment units, each labeled only with a number. Inside were boxes of files, photos, charts, behavioral reports. All 10 boys' names were listed, but only 3 were marked as unaccounted for. Jesse Whitmore was one of them. The case was closed quietly. Official reports claimed no conclusive evidence of foul play. The state issued an apology to the families for the grief, for the years without answers, but not for what was done. Because what was done, officially, never happened. Mills resigned. The files vanished. and the forest was finally fenced off, this time permanently. But sometimes, on cold nights, when the wind passes through the trees near Dead Oak Hill, locals say you can hear a hum. A low, constant vibration, like the soft whir of old machinery buried just below the roots. And if you listen closely, you might hear the echo of children's laughter or crying. The truth was never broadcast. It was whispered and buried. Because some truths aren't meant to be known, and some buses never arrive, because they were never supposed to.